Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Carol Sakey speaking. We need to learn more about how data measurements are collected because the World Health Organization, the UN, introduced what is called the well-being indicators for measuring data sets, stats, etc. And this is called measuring not numbers but rates. So I go back to a report on the 7th of April by One News, where Judith Collins slammed edited New Zealand mental health stats as being deceitful and extremely cruel. And she said that, there needs to be some answer as to why these stats for suicide have been delayed and there have been dramatic edits. Stuff New Zealand jumped on board and they revealed that the indicators usually used in a routine annual report of the government's mental health services had been removed. So much was revealed in a request to the Officials Information Act for more information as to suicide stats, wait times, etc. So the Ministry of Health told Stuff New Zealand it was trying to modernise the way it presents stats, not to hide anything. Really? Well, I'll see about that one. Because, stats can be easily influenced and persuaded. So the chief coroner, she releases a report. And stats are collected by the coroner's office. The coroner's office determines what the cause of death is, whether it's suicide or other, and the government give out their published stats as well. So there's two different reporting avenues. Now, the difference between the two is that reporting of suicide stats via the coroner's office is actually reported. The end date is the 30th of June, which is the end of the financial year. And for the government, the Ministry of Health, it's the 31st of December, the end of the calendar year. So that makes this collecting of data sets, measurements, not comparable. So they're not compatible. So the chief coroner released a report in 2020 showing that 654 people had suicide in the year to the end of June, which is the 30th, and 31 less suicides than in 2019 were reported. In 2020, that was 654, and 2019, 685 deaths. So that's 31 less suicides reported on this last lot of stats. So I'm personally questioning that because knowing what's happening, these terrible events that have happened in New Zealand that have disrupted people's lives, how can there possibly be less suicide? It's been so damn depressing for so many people. So what have we got? We've got people who have lost their job, their businesses, more people on the welfare benefits. We've also got added to that the housing crisis, mental health crisis, and it goes on. There is a lot that's been thrown into the mix, which are really serious problems. So what is this all about? Modernising appears to be the feature these days of everything in New Zealand. This is the deliberate destruction of traditionalism, traditional values, Christian values, and so forth, so on. New Zealand government is determining collectivism over individualism, globalism over nationalism. Nationalism is putting your own country's interests first. That's patriotism. So we're talking about, businesses, jobs being lost, farmers being targeted, livelihoods being threatened, loss of home and income for the farmers, because if they lose their business, their farming, then they lose their livelihood, their homes as well. So I decided to look further into this because I had been previously looking at these well-being indicators, and they are very, very complex. There's a lot thrown into the mix. So this YouTube video is about Ministry of Health, the Coroner's Office reports, and suicide data in New Zealand, because I do question that. So suicide data is reported by way of data sets and measurements by both the Coroner's Office and the Ministry of Health, which is the government. And as I say, at two different time periods. So end of the 30th of June, so 30th of June for the Coroner's Office, and the 31st of December for the Ministry of Health government. So the Coroner's Office actually determines whether a death is intentional or not, whether a person intends to kill themselves intentionally, and the evidence must be beyond reasonable doubt that the person did intentionally kill themselves. It was self-inflicted, purposely so. So some deaths are suspected to be suicide, may be confirmed as death by another cause after the coroner's inquiry, and it's all down to the coroner's inquiry. So suicide is reported by two sources in New Zealand: the Chief Coroner's Office for provisional self-inflicted death data. This is referred to as suspected suicides, still under investigation. And the Ministry of Health released official suicide data. There are differences between the two data sets, their measurements, and as I say, they're not comparable. The government and the coroner's offices actually report in different time frames. So the deaths included in the government's data are not always confirmed suicides. They're inconclusive as whether the death was by suicide or not. Data measurements reported by the Coroner's Office are published as provisional. These count as suspected suicides. Provisional means they exist for the present, possibly changed later, includes data where the coroner has not yet established if the person's suicidal or not, so they are suspected of suiciding. So after a coroner's inquiry, it may be ruled that some of these deaths were not suicide. So the government determines their professional data as to suggestion and presumption as to death, whether they are or are not a cause of suicide. So please note, the Ministry of Health government website states the number of suicides reported by the Chief Coroner's Office are generally higher than those reported by the government Ministry of Health. They're not comparable. The government's official suicide data is published when most investigations of death are completed. Note, most. Does not necessarily mean all. The government webpage states it is less likely that any updates to info in the Ministry of Health's mortality collection, that's the government's, after data publication are less likely to change the cause of death, numbers, rates for the given period of interest. Note the wording, less likely. Less likely does not guarantee factual evidence of numbers of published reported deaths of suicide. It's not factual, it's not to the point. It is less likely does not mean it is guaranteed. It is factual. So the government's final publishing of suicide data and updates of mortality rate is when there are 10 or fewer deaths under the coroner's investigation. This means where no cause of death has been determined yet. The government aims to release data within 2 years of the year of interest under the government's open data program. This is to meet the government's time frames. The government's provisional data is released when the number of deaths referred to the coroner's office is no higher than 30. Note, the government at this time have no info about the cause of death at this point in time. Where the government uses the term coded death, and they do in their documentation on their website, this means any cause of death that is numerically under 250 deaths. Government measures suicides by rates, measures, data sets. How often a suicide death occurs in relation to the population number in a given period of time. Typically, this is reported per 100,000 population. So the Ministry of Health website states rates are more meaningful and more useful than numbers. So forget the numbers, we're working on rates, which are data sets and measurements of well-being indicators. So they're more useful when comparing suicide data over a period of time. Also, they say it's more useful and meaningful for comparing suicide data between Maori and non-Maori. The government's reported numbers of deaths as to suicide might be aggregated over 5 years periods to give sufficient numbers with which to calculate a robust rate, as suicide numbers vary from year to year. Well, we know they vary from year to year, but what do they mean by aggregate? So, suicide rates may be aggregated. So what's the difference between aggregated and total suicide rates, say? Then aggregated is formed by a collection of particulars into a whole mass of something. It's like combined and collective, whereas total is the entire number of the measurement, the whole of something. So aggregator does not define the total when it comes to the government calculating what they call a robust rate of suicides. It's quite complex, really, but when you get into it, you can see what's happening. As the government website states, therefore, it can be hard to tell whether suicides are decreasing or increasing. They say this themselves. So by looking at the short-term data, which short-term they call annual, it's hard to tell whether suicide rates are increasing or decreasing. So how are we to believe what this government is reporting? And it goes on to state that caution is recommended when comparing international data rates from other countries, saying not all data suicide reporting practices are the same. So if our government does typically compare our suicide rates, our data rates with international ones, but this needs to be treated with caution, and we need to question it, because not all practices for reporting suicide rates across all countries are the same. It's different in different countries. Different countries use different standards to determine whether a death is suicide. Investigations are not always undertaken, and not all countries provide the level of proof as death is a suicide or not. Some countries may not require for a death to be recorded as suicide, and yet our government typically compares our suicide rates and our data sets and our measurements with other countries when they put the whole lot concluded together to publish to the people of New Zealand. So there's also issues in other countries relating to religion, social class, occupation, victim, criminal status, government interference, influences, and manipulations. So publish stats, data sets, measurements to meet the goal of governments, corrupt governments, manipulation of data sets and measurements for the government's self-interest for power and status, for more power to govern the peoples. Government interference, influences, manipulations. So we're talking about governments through these data sets and measurements. When they're concluded, they then set their policies to govern the people. So political self-interest. Government can manipulate, influence, persuade data sets, measurements out of political self-interest to determine policies, giving them more status, power and control over New Zealanders. Information required on questionnaires when recording stats from members of the general public can be influential, persuaded by the language, the text, the wording used, and it can be subtle and it can be biased. It can be manipulated, it can be influencing, and it can be persuasive to get the end result that the government needs for their predetermined policies. So the New Zealand government utilised the World Health Organization wellbeing indicators, measurements, data sets. These are applied to many, almost all aspects of collecting data in measurements in New Zealand data sets to determine the government's policy making, including that of mental health. Wellbeing indicators, data sets, measurements, they are extremely complex and effectively can be influenced and biased and manipulated, fit for government purpose. So more info can be found on the International Suicide Data Organisation for Economic Cooperation, that's OECD, and the World Health Organization, UN. But if you are looking at the website, the official website for the World Health Organization, the UN, remember they play around with their language, and you really have to know what they're really saying. So it takes a lot of looking at what they're saying and interpreting it as to what it really is. So I have provided several government links, etc., that you can follow, and I will be making another video to this because I feel that we need to, because of policy making in New Zealand, the laws that are being made, and they are hastily being made behind the closed doors of Parliament in that toilet bowl of Wellington, where lots of crap is happening and a lot of shit is going to be thrown at New Zealanders. So we really do need to know what is happening with this data sets, these measurements, wellbeing indicators, because that's what's determining how your lives are going to be under Ardern's government. So wake up, New Zealand. Please share, and subscribe.